Let's get into some Christian nationalism, I believe. Yeah.
So you see, I also call myself a Christian nationalist, and that's not a bad word.
Wash your mouth out with soap.
Your dirty mouth needs a bath.
Dirty mouth needs a bath. Now, I apologize ahead of time. My stories are kind of stuck up here at the top of the show, so you'll get a lot of me at the beginning, but don't worry, Gons has got the rest of the show. So, happy Veterans Day, everybody.
Yes.
We want to honor the veterans, Canary Cry veterans, of which there are many. Yes, indeed. And we've got a lot to say about the military-industrial complex and the government's lies that are now becoming, common knowledge and talked about in the mainstream. But we always want to make sure that we separate out the critique of, endless wars and military-industrial complex and stuff like that from the actual quality human beings, most of which are veterans, people serving their country, people making sacrifices that the rest of us could barely understand. So we want to honor all of the Canary Cry veterans, and of course, all the veterans around the world. One notable one is Brother Rob, which was Dame Gail, Canary Whisperer and Lady of X's and O's, her brother, who passed away last year. I think it was almost exactly a year ago. So we just want to thank Brother Rob for his service and thank Dame Gail for being a big supporter of the show for so long.
Do you have anybody directly in family that was in military service? Yeah,
my grandfather is of World War II age and participated in his own special way. It was so yes, I will be calling him later today. What about you?
Yeah, I got my father-in-law who passed away this year. So he was in the military. I don't know that I would count my grandpa on my my mother's side.
On your Japanese side?
My Japanese side. I don't think they were on the right side of the right side of the war.
Dun, dun, dun.
But yeah. I'm an infiltrator from the East.
Did your grandpa actually fight for Japan?
I think he flew some planes in the 40s.
Here's the question.
It wasn't a kamikaze.
Did he land some planes?
He did.
Yeah, he landed the planes.
He wasn't part of the kamikaze crew there. So
got it. Okay. Well, there you go, folks. There's that's how history works out for you. Mm-hmm. So I had this article. I was actually going to bring it last episode, but I thought, we'll wait for Veterans Day because it's I don't know. It's an interesting look at the veterans' place in society, not just, historically, but with the movement, the cultural movements that are going on now. And surprise, surprise, Gons, this one's from The Intercept.
I think you need
I've been on an Intercept binge.
You have. You need to do something about that. Either
No. So, what part of my Intercept binge is similar to what the CNN binge was last year,
right, which
is the fascination in watching, the internal struggle of these mainstream outlets about, what to write about, what side to take, testing the waters on either side of the business that is journalism. And the Intercept is interesting because they're kind of this weird mix of economic, profiles, economic systems. They kind of are leaning into this independence type of thing, like asking for donations, becoming a member, premium content, all this stuff. And yet, they're still corporate.
I didn't know the owner of The Intercept. You probably know this already, but he's the founder of eBay.
I didn't know that.
Pierre Omidyar. This is on the Harvard media ownership list.
Oh, good. Yeah, let us know.
And it says Omidyar donates to many efforts around disinformation, journalism, and diversity in media through his foundation, Democracy Fund, and Luminate. Ooh, so close. He's got
so close.
He's ill. If he's ill, then he's Illuminate.
So this came from The Intercept. Okay. The headline is this: America's 9/11 wars created the foot soldiers of far-right violence at home. Dun, dun, dun. And you talk about the 9/11 wars. I think it's interesting. Wars, multiple, they put there. It's just,
it's a subtle giveaway there. 9/11 wars.
Wars, multiple wars. Going to be talking about the forever wars here. Created the foot soldiers. And you think created the foot soldiers, of course, we've talked about, the radicalization of young men in the Middle East becoming terrorists because of these 9/11 wars, becoming foot soldiers for Al-Qaeda and then ISIS and stuff like this. But no, we're not talking about that. We're talking about the far right violence at home.
Of course, it's the same program they did in those other countries, but they're just doing it on our homeboys here.
Exactly.
And gals.
So let's see how The Intercept is honoring our veterans this week. Nathan Bedford Forrest was one of the most aggressive generals of his generation, and after his military service ended in a bitter fashion, he went home to Tennessee and found a new way to fight. A defeated general in the Confederate Army, Forrest joined the Ku Klux Klan and was named its inaugural Grand Wizard.
Ooh, yay, so, he's a wizard.
Starting off strong, okay? So he was a general for the Confederates, and then was mad about it and became a Grand Wizard at the Ku Klux Klan. Forrest was in the first wave of American veterans who turned to domestic terror once they returned home.
Domestic terror.
You talk about, first wave feminism, second wave feminist, stuff like that. This is first wave American veteran domestic terror.
Huh,
you might learn about second wave.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. It also happened after World War I and II, after the Korean and Vietnam Wars. And it is happening after the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Yeah.
The World War I and II and Korean specifically, what they're referring to, they actually do hyperlink, and I don't want to get too off track here, but there was a group of people who are very rarely talked about after the Korean War and the World War II, who became, they were veterans who became anti-war activists, basically. And they would camp out. One famous one was, some huge number. It was like 100,000 veterans actually camped out in Washington to protest the Korean War. And I mean, it was just, the streets were littered with these veterans from World War II who were being, they were anti-war. They were trying to make a statement and stuff. And the president at the time, and I just don't have it right in front of me. I forget who it was. Maybe Nixon. I don't know. Whoever it was. There's a quote from them literally telling the police to go shoot them all. That's how veterans were being treated, even back after World War II. So let's continue. It also happened after World War I and II, after the Korean War and Vietnam Wars, and it is happening after the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. The sedition trial, now taking place in Washington, D.C., features 5 defendants accused of trying to overthrow the government on January 6th.
Wait a minute.
And 4 are veterans, including Stuart Rhodes, who founded the Oath Keepers Militia. In December, another sedition trial is set for 5 members of the Proud Boys militia, 4 of whom served in the military. Are you seeing the picture that's being painted here, guys?
So they're using Jan 6 as sort of we already knew it kind of, but it is not the culmination, the catalyzing or the solidifying of
it's the moment. Yeah, it's the moment that is referred back to where veterans turn to domestic terror.
Right.
Yeah. The point here is not that all or most veterans are dangerous. Notice how it's just dangerous. They're not even they don't even say domestic. They just generally say dangerous. The point here is not that all or most veterans are dangerous. Those who engage in far-right extremism are a fraction of the more than 18 million Americans who have served in the armed forces and returned to civilian life without indulging in political violence. of 897 people indicted after the January 6th insurrection. Nice. 118 have military backgrounds. According to the program on extremism at George Washington University, the point is that a relatively small number of veterans are having an outsized impact on white supremacist violence, thanks to the respect that flows from their military service. So notice they're having the outsized impact on white supremacist violence, specifically because of people respecting veterans. Respecting them for their military service is what we have to thank for their domestic violence, which is sinister messaging coming through on this Intercept article. While they are outliers from the mass of law-abiding vets, they are the tent poles of domestic terror. Tent poles. Have you heard this term?
Tent poles.
Yeah. Have you heard this term in other contexts?
Maybe. I don't know.
Maybe. Okay. So
I think I understand what it means.
Yeah. The other place that this is often used is in show business with movie studios. You know, a movie studio might put out 20 movies a year or something, whatever the number is. But most of them are entirely unprofitable. Right. They don't make any money.
Yeah.
But it's the one movie they call the tent pole that basically pays for the rest of the movie. So like Marvel, you know, a Marvel movie was super successful. All the money it makes actually funds the other movies being made. Right. So to use that for, veterans being the tent pole of domestic terror is kind of the statement there is domestic terror can only happen because of veterans of other wars. And that is a very sort of intense, I mean, that's an extreme thing to say here.
It's speaking of extremism.
Yeah, exactly. Quote, when these guys get involved with extremism, they shoot to the top of the ranks and they are very effective at recruiting more people to the cause, noted Michael Jensen, a senior researcher at the University of Maryland's study of terrorism and responses to terrorism. This is a consequence of our society venerating a massive army and going to war at regular intervals. Now, notice again, just to deconstruct the message here, they're saying domestic terrorism is tent-poled, is mostly due to our society venerating a massive army and going to war at regular intervals.
Like Veterans Day, by the way, right? Like this would be an example.
Sort of an example. But what they're saying is even more incorrect because they're saying that we're actually supporting going to war at regular intervals, when the data actually shows most people in this country are anti-war and don't want to get into war and think the repetitive forever wars are a bad thing. And yet the Intercept is reporting here that, you know, the American people are supporting all these wars when in fact it's the elite ruling class who make money through the, you know, Wall Street and military industrial complex that want these wars, that support the wars, that sometimes even exacerbate the situations that lead to these wars. It is not the people. You take a poll of every American citizen, majority of them are anti-war. And yet the Intercept here carrying water for the military industrial complex, blaming all of these wars on support from the public, when in fact, the public does not support them. So at its very foundation, the Intercept here, this is written by a fellow named Peter Maass, by the way, Maass. So I'll say Peter specifically is sort of corrupting the idea of why we get into these wars, that people actually want it. No, we don't.
Plus, it says here, venerating a massive army and going to war in regular intervals. So, you know, all that venerating of massive army is a propagandized aspect of the military industrial complex. So it's not that the people are just so into it. It's kind of pushed into our throats, kind of like.
And again, the data shows that most people would prefer that we make the army, military, less funding. The money that goes to the military could be used to make the homeland, more prosperous and safer and better for everybody.
Right.
But the reason that we don't is because now, look, I do also want to say out loud, so much of the benefits of living in America, so many of them that we may not even be able to list, are directly a result of our military superiority. So even when you're anti-war or obscene military funding, a lot of people don't realize that objectively, and this is part of the complicated part, and this is why we're a complex show, folks, is you must admit that any, value, quality of life that Americans have over other countries is almost directly related to our military superiority. And you have to remember that if we did not have what we have militarily, our quality of life would diminish in many ways. Now, would it balance out over time? I don't know, probably. But I don't want to be one of those people who ignore the fact that much of our quality of life is directly related to our size of our military. Again, oftentimes committing atrocities overseas and inventing wars. But, it's all tied together. So I don't want to seem like I don't realize that it is tied together. And we should all remember that. But let's continue. The last 50 years of far-right terror have been dominated by men with military backgrounds. Most infamously, there was Gulf War veteran Timothy McVeigh, who set off the Oklahoma City bomb in 1995 that killed 168 people. There was Eric Rudolph, an Army vet who planted bombs at the 1996 Atlanta Olympics, as well as 2 abortion clinics and a gay bar. There was Louis Beam, a Vietnam veteran and Klansman who became a dark visionary of the white power movement in the 1980s and was tried for sedition in 1988. Parenthetical, he was acquitted along with 13 other defendants. The list is nearly endless. Nearly endless, Gons.
Seems pretty short so far. He's got 3 examples here.
I don't know exactly what nearly endless means. It seems like actually an impossible phrase, but okay. Nearly endless. A founder of the neo-Nazi Atomwaffen division was a vet, while the founder of the base, another neo-Nazi group, was an intelligence contractor for the U.S. military in Iraq and Afghanistan. And the man who attacked an FBI office in Cincinnati after federal agents searched the Mar-a-Lago home of former President Donald Trump in August was, you guessed it, a veteran.
Oh, those horrible veterans.
Mm-hmm, exactly.
They're jumping all over history here. If it's such an endless list, they go through 60 years, 70 years of his American history to come up with a paragraph. They can mention names. Yeah.
I wonder what the list would be compared to non-veterans. But no, that's not important. This is the news, Gons. Adjacent to the violence, remember, the narrative is more important than the facts. Right. Adjacent to the violence, key figures in far-right politics come from the military and boast of their wartime service, such as former General Michael Flynn, who has emerged as a high-profile promoter of QAnon-ish conspiracy theories, as well as an election denialist. In New Hampshire, former General Donald Bolduc is the GOP candidate for Senate and a spreader of lunatic ideas that include the notion that school children are allowed to identify as cats and use litter boxes. Parenthetical, do a web search of Bolduc litter box. I'm actually kind of curious about that.
You don't know about this? No? Okay, I heard about it.
No, I mean, it kind of rings a bell, but I could just be making it up in my head, but sure. I believe it. Yeah. GOP gubernatorial candidate Doug Mastriano, reportedly the point person for Trump's fake elector scheme in Pennsylvania, blanketed his campaign with so much military imagery that the Pentagon told him to dial it back. When they do hyperlink that sounds like a funny story, but for another show. The why of this pattern is complex. Okay, here's the why, Gons. It's complex. Yep. So, of course, they're going to make it simple for us to understand.
Intercept.
Here. When wars are drenched in now listen to this. And this is why I can't peel away from the Intercept. because they say things like this. The why of the pattern is complex. When wars are drenched in as many high-level lies and pointless deaths as the ones in Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan, there is no shortage of good reasons for veterans to feel betrayed by their government. So they admit that these wars are drenched in lies and pointless deaths, drenched in high-level lies and pointless deaths, and blaming it on the government and saying there's no wonder that people are so, veterans get into shenanigans because the government is constantly lying and killing their friends for no reason. Which, whoa, okay, Intercept, what a interesting and complex tapestry you are weaving. Leaving the service can be a fraught process even without that baggage. After years in an institution that brought order and meaning to their lives and that defined the world in a simplistic binary of good versus evil, veterans can feel adrift at home and yearn for purpose and camaraderie they had in the military. As the Special Forces veteran turned journalist, Jack Murphy wrote, he's a journalist, so he's one of the good ones, of his comrades who fell into QAnon and other conspiratorial mindsets. Quote, "You get to be part of a movement of like-minded people. You're fighting evil in a worldview that you have become comfortable with. Now you know why you don't recognize America, not because you had a silly preconception of it from the beginning, but rather because, again, there's sort of admitting like, yes, our notion of America is a narrative that's fed to us and created for us, but rather because it has been undermined by a satanic cabal."
Wow. This is such a, the devil doesn't exist kind of thing where I'm trying to parse it into words here, but
sure.
It's sort of, their own doing. They're calling themselves out and admitting to, sort of the manipulative ways in which the government is involved, but then they're sort of pulling out the rug or not pulling out the rug, but just, I don't know, when people start, and this is not me agreeing with the QAnon or conspiracies or anything. Okay. So, well, I guess we're not on YouTube right now, so it doesn't matter. But in terms of, they're kind of talking about this in a psychological sense, like, these veterans, they don't recognize the America that they're protecting. And so therefore, they latch onto these theories about the satanic cabal taking over. Of course, the satanic cabal has taken over the country, when it's like, realistically, the whole concept of America from the beginning was sort of in that direction. You can call it you can. I think we can all admit that for someone to enthusiastically volunteer to join a war, they are drenched in a certain narrative that is crafted that economically is advantageous to the military industrial complex and the government. You do have to buy in. You have to have a certain amount of buy-in. And look, again, I'm not saying that anybody who buys in is whatever, weak-minded or explicitly gullible or anything. It's explicitly
masterful. Exactly. It's a masterful exploitation of well-meaning people. Right. And it's anybody who supports one of these wars, even in theory, is caught up in the masterful crafting of the narrative. And what I just said might sound like abstract or radical in some way. It's really not. That is what The Intercept is saying here. That is the whole point of, and now they're taking it in another direction, which is like something like, they bought into the narrative the first time, so it's so easy for them to buy into a different narrative the second time.
Yeah, and that's the thing. It's the satanic cabal, so to speak. Maybe not an organized thing, but certainly in the philosophy and the spiritual sense too. So the satanic cabal is sort of exploiting over the years the general public and their willingness to defend the country and all these honorable things to go to war to benefit the military industrial complex. But now that things are becoming more transparent, they're kind of calling it out, like, you know, and they can frame it in the QAnon thing to dismiss it. But really, it's the emergence of the realities of sort of a general type of satanic cabal, you can call it, doing things to manipulate. And now they're being called out. So now they're like, well, you know, it's ridiculous to think that, even though, you know, they're the ones that were kind of doing the whole thing and admitting that, hey, there was the first time was a ruse. So,
and we see this tactic that we see all the time. We made a big deal about it last episode, which is equating a group of people, a small group of people, with this narrative, this crafted narrative. So equating someone, having changed their mindset about America, about the role of the military, about, you know, how they were lied to get to sign up or whatever. You know, they're equating the narrative with the most extreme version, which is QAnon, satanic cabal type of thing. Like, you can't even simply disagree. You can't be, this is one more step in the direction of, you cannot be anti-war. We saw the construction of that narrative last episode. Anti-war means supporting Putin, means Christian nationalist, means they're being equated. Now, being anti-war is equated with being QAnon, the most demonized group of people in the mainstream media. So even to disagree with our participation in war means that you are a crazy QAnon conspiracy theorist, extreme, you know, right-wing domestic terrorist. We've seen this escalation of equating, inconvenient groups of people with the most extreme version. And this is another example, except for 3-4 days before Veterans Day, they specifically target veterans as, you know, the next group of people to lump in.
Yeah, that's pretty disturbing.
The paragraph's almost the article's almost finished. There's an added twist that historian Kathleen Belew points out, that while the role of veterans in domestic terror is underappreciated, they are not the only ones unhinged by war. And this is another very interesting aspect to The Intercept's writing here, which is not the same angle that you'll find in other places, and why I'm so into navigating The Intercept right now. Quote, "The biggest factor in domestic terror seems not to be what we have often assumed, be it populism, immigration, poverty, major civil rights legislation. Belew noted in a recent podcast, quote, it seems to be an aftermath of war. This is significant not only because of the presence of veterans and active duty troops within these groups, but I think it's reflective of something bigger, which is that the measure of violence of all kinds in our society spikes in the aftermath of war." Talking about all kinds of violence. That measure goes across men and women. It goes across people who have and have not served. It goes across age group. There is something about all of us that is more available for violent activity in the aftermath of conflict, which I don't know what the exact data on that is, but it makes sense to me, and I can see why it would be a beneficial aspect to keeping us in perpetual war. Perhaps keeping us in perpetual war is an attempt to, you know, not end a war so that this violence can express itself. Or maybe it's a part of the constant riling up and the dividing of the populace so that they don't, you know, team up against a ruling elite class or something. But this lady's just saying, yeah, just generally when there's war, everybody gets more violent. In 2005, the so-called war on terror was justified by President George W. Bush as, quote, taking the fight to the terrorists abroad so we do not have to face them at home. The irony is that those wars, which cost trillions of dollars and killed hundreds of thousands of civilians, instead radicalized a generation of American zealots who for years to come will inflict violence on the country they were supposed to protect. This is yet another stupendous offense for which our political and military leaders should face history's vengeance. So they end it by admitting that domestic terrorism and violence in general increasing due to war is the responsibility of the ruling class, the elite ruling class, which you really would not get from this writing until literally the very last sentence. But it is fascinating to see in the whole scope of, the Intercept's place in the mainstream media. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, covered it while we were walking through most of it. But sure, it seems like, they're tiptoeing a fine line there between, and I think this is sort of an effect of the world we're in now. It's more, things are a little more transparent. Trust is low on any kind of government. Right. There is a movement of, pushing back against traditional forms of war or things that are framed in the traditional type of threats of war, because it's a little different now. Like we're in this country, especially, we constantly compare situations to, World War I, World War II, Vietnam, and certainly there are points to be taken, but we're just in like the communications apparatus today is completely different from all those wars. So it is a completely different type of war. You can call it a psychological war or whatever. And so in that context, to target veterans as the sort of boots on the ground, the foot soldiers, as they said,
foot soldiers, right,
of the far right violence is really particular in creating the bad guy. It's almost like, there's an analogy in there somewhere, but I don't know the exact details of but sort of, you create something, you create Frankenstein kind of, and it's like a project. But now that Frankenstein's out there, now that people are starting to suspect that you're the guy that created it, you're kind of like, no, Frankenstein's his own thing.
No, they went crazy on their own.
They went crazy. Yeah. Right. They went crazy on their own, and they're not really admitting that they're admitting it without admitting the consequences of what's going on.
Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting to connect it with some other, veteran related topics that we've talked about, like psychedelic therapy, PTSD stuff. You could see how at some high level there would be, let's give all the veterans mushrooms, because if you have, a psychedelic experience, you're probably less likely to join a militia or, carry out an act of violence or terrorism, which is fine, I guess, except for it's taking it out of like, we should help these guys just because of who they are and what they did, and not necessarily so they don't go on some sort of right-wing rampage.
And then remember that NIH paper we found the other day about how it's more ethical to covertly give any kind of bio enhancements to populations. Right. I mean, this is all justifying the same kind of stuff where they put LSD in the water of a small town, that experiment with MK Ultra. Yeah. It's the same kind of thing, but now they're like, well, we got all the legal framework in place here. And so behind closed doors, they're like, well, it's more ethical to try to. I mean,
we've covered some real serious conversations at the highest levels of society about surreptitiously dosing water supplies with low level psychedelics. And you could see, especially in a post-COVID world, especially with the NIH paper talking about secretly, basically drugging people is the moral thing to do and stuff like this. So you could see where we are not that far away from, a systematic, dosing of a population as a counterterrorism measure.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. If you're a vet, you won't be able to go anywhere unless you have the injections.
As an official national security measure, we are dosing all water supplies with you know what I mean?
And we're not going to hear the division, the propaganda to bring people into the military will not stop either. You know what I mean? Both are going to happen. We're going to continue to have veterans from the perpetual war, but then also they're being kind of marginalized, blamed for some of this. It's crazy. This is insane.
And again, it kind of goes to the original sort of military boot camp idea where you break them down to build them back up, as what you want.
It's the occult thing too with rituals. It's a trauma-based mind control thing.
Exactly. It's a very similar thing with even with the framing of veterans in this way in the mainstream media, because it is sort of a moralistic breaking down of the veterans' identity. If you can convince the population that veterans are dangerous right-wing extremist domestic terrorists, that is breaking them down, breaking down their status in society, the trust of people around them, maybe even as close as their friends and family. Yeah. And once you break them down enough, you can build them up in the way you want them to go, perhaps through secretly dosing them with psychedelics. There was one other, I just wanted to point out one more article from the same guy, Peter Mass, written by the same guy. This is from back in August, but he wrote this article, the headline, "An accused war criminal trained Florida cops in new concepts of shooting." And it's about Eddie Gallagher. Are you familiar with Eddie Gallagher?
No.
A very interesting thing. There's been a bunch of podcasts, a lot of very interesting research into this guy. Eddie Gallagher was an officer in the military and kind of went nuts, allegedly, and was sort of killing. He was a sniper, and he would just shoot people, just shoot civilians, just shoot whoever. He kind of is sort of described as this monster, like this kind of psychopathic monster who just would commit war crimes regularly. And the people in his unit, the guys in his unit, like reported him, and it's a whole thing. Long story short, he got what's the word? Not forgiven, but pardoned by Trump. And so he's connected to all that. But apparently this alleged war criminal pardoned by Trump is now training police forces on new techniques and shooting and stuff like that. So just kind of another data point of like veterans just being bad for society or whatever. Again, another reason to secretly dose everybody.
The Pentagon's 1033 program, huh? It's mentioned in the article. Interesting.
Yeah, all sorts of interesting stuff. So there you go. This Peter Mass guy is kind of hyper focused on veteran related reporting. So there you go. Happy Veterans Day, everybody. Yep. And luckily, I don't think this is going to cause the whole country to turn their backs on veterans overnight.